All right, so I put the reading up on the screen. So if we want to reference or show anything, let me know and I can scroll it.
Okay.
Do you want to kick it off, AJ, or do you want me to talk a little?
How about you start?
All right. Yeah, unfortunately, with our small little crew here, it's not quite the same as the bigger reading group that we had envisioned.
That's fine.
But yeah, we'll do that later. So for this, we thought about going over The Tyranny of Structurelessness here by Joe Freeman. It's a kind of a classic among feminist organizers because of talking about structurelessness, which was kind of a theme that came out of the 1960s and 70s, kind of a counter to things being too kind of centralized and fears of things being too authoritarian. People kind of responded to that saying, no, we're not going to have leaders and structure and things like that because we don't want to be that way. We don't want to be like the oppressors. And unfortunately, if that's taken to extremes, it ends up in its own problems that the author here writes about. So what I had noted was it has a few different kind of main topics here. The first one is the differences between formal and informal structures. Kind of stood out as something important to me, where kind of the basic idea being if you don't formalize structures, if you don't have a set of rules on how your organization operates and who's in charge of what and who's responsible for what, if that's not formalized into a set of rules, then it becomes informal. It becomes this hidden background thing where decisions have to be made no matter what. So if there's no official formal process, then it's going to be an unofficial informal process behind the scenes. So you actually by not formalizing things, you're actually running the risk of becoming less democratic as opposed to more democratic. And that kind of led into the discussion of elitism and what the elite is. And I actually personally like this little thing in here that an individual is not an elite. Elite only makes sense when you're talking about a group structure or lack of structure, either way, right? The elite are the people who are making those decisions behind the scenes when you don't have the appropriate democratic structure. When you don't have the formalisms in place where everyone can participate, then there's going to be a small group that's making the decisions behind the scenes. Because again, decisions have to be made. Someone has to make them. So if there's no formal process for it, some group of people is going to end up doing it behind the scenes. And while this applies, of course, to smaller groups, that one of the things I immediately thought of is like, this is pretty much how Congress and all works, that they disappear behind the scenes and shadows and they write bills and they just come out and say, here's the law now. And it's because the system as it exists today is just not very democratic. It's not real democracy because, for one thing, people are not directly involved in lawmaking. But even in a representative capacity, they're not even particularly representative. So, it kind of shows you again, if you don't have that democratic structure from the beginning, it decays into these more informal things. Yeah, so also, related to the elite was also this kind of star system where they said if your organization has to communicate with the outside world, right, outside of your organization, if you don't have some formal process to decide how does everyone in your organization feel about a topic, and how do we communicate that to the outside world, again, without formalness, it becomes this informal thing where you have like a star player, you have like somebody who's a celebrity, I guess, right? The celebrity begins to be the fill-in person that the news calls them up and says, hey, what do you think about this? And they look at you as if you're the representative of the organization, even though that's never been formally decided. Maybe even a lot of members don't even, want that person to speak for them, but that's just what ends up informally happening because, again, there's no structure there. So you end up with people kind of representing the organization, even though they don't actually represent the organization. So it's again all kind of arguments about why you would want formalness, I think. So it talked also about some conditions that make groups effective, that they have to be task oriented, they have to be small and homogeneous, that they relatively sync up with each other in terms of ideas and goals. They have to communicate with each other highly, and there's a low degree of skill specialization. So that means as we had said earlier, I always thought about like rotating job skills and rotating roles, and that's kind of how I interpreted this low degree of skill specialization, that it's very easy for you to rotate roles and for everyone to get experience doing everything, so that no one person is in charge of it and becomes the informal leader. Instead, everyone kind of knows how it works, so everyone can kind of step in and make decisions together democratically if they need to. And the last bit here was some tips from the author, basically about how to. Up to this point was kind of an argument about why you want to avoid structurelessness, and so kind of this last section is, okay, we don't want to be structureless, so what does democratic structure look like? And so there's some tips down here about delegating tasks to individuals so that they become responsible for them. So there's a person who's responsible, and if it doesn't get done or something like that, there's a person responsible that you can talk to them and ask, why did it not happen, or can we help you with that, or whatever it is. If you're not actually delegating and making someone responsible, then no one's responsible. Everyone says, oh, I thought so-and-so was doing it, and it never happens. So I can kind of relate to that. Distribute authority over as many people as possible. That's also a democratic principle. You don't want one leader. You don't want a small group of elites. You want as many people involved in decision-making as possible. And depending on the decision, maybe not even everyone wants to be involved. Maybe some people say, nah, I don't even really care about that. They don't have to be involved, but they should at least be kind of invited, right? You want to spread the net as far as possible. Rotating job tasks that we mentioned. Allocating tasks that make sense. And the biggest takeaway for me is that you learn through apprenticeship, that if someone is new to something, make sure that they have someone they can ask questions from, and don't just throw them in and, oh, you've never did graphic design before, but we need a graphic for our event by tomorrow at 1 p.m. Then not only is it probably not going to happen, but now that person is very frustrated because they don't know what to do. They felt like they've been left alone. They feel, you start to feel animosity toward the group. Why did they leave me stuck with this? So I kind of related to that myself. You want to have a diffusion of information. You want to make sure that everyone's aware of what's going on. Again, not everyone has to be involved in every decision making in the group, but everyone should be aware that it's going on. And if they want to be involved, then they know how to be involved because they're aware of what's going on. And of course, equal access to resources. You want to make sure that everyone in the group has the resources to get involved, and that they don't have to go through a bunch of hops to find what they need, as we found out with Zoom tonight. It's important that people can do what they need to do without being restricted from it, whether accidental or if the group's too informal, it might be on purpose, right? you People might try to lock each other out if they're not happy with each other. So you want to try to prevent that situation, that only the group together democratically is making decisions like that. So that was kind of the notes that I had written up when I read through this, and stuff that kind of stood out to me. So I'd love to hear what stood out to AJ and Jordan if you had a chance to look at it.
Well, I can really tell why you chose this article. This is actually something that I've kind of been struggling with running one of the clubs that I'm involved with, because like I want it to feel a little more democratic, but at the same time there's a lot of moving parts, and so having me and two other friends are basically at the top of a hierarchy, and it's more of I don't see it as a hierarchy. I see it more as like we have certain roles, and my position in the project kind of makes a lot of sense because I understand the project better than most of the people, especially the people who are like very focused on individual aspects of it. But trying to figure out how to make sure that there is, the diffusion of information through the group, and ability for people to kind of make sure that their voices are heard is something that I've been trying to figure out how it's done when there is this kind of hierarchy that's built into the group already.
Yeah, those are interesting questions about if an organization is already formed and kind of has this informal structure, what do you do about it?
Now, the worst part is that I was like very involved in the designing of the structure, but it was like a very new club, so we needed to be able to figure out how to deal with, let's say, 120 members. If we like all of a sudden got 100 new people, right? How do you deal with that? So we did kind of decide that we needed some sort of kind of hierarchical structure.
Yeah, and this is something we've run into in the Green Party, or at least I've seen this in the Green Party, where certain rules make sense, but only at certain levels. I guess I'll call it certain. I guess levels. When you have a smaller local group, certain rules work really well for that. But then when you go up to like a national level organization, those rules don't work at all anymore, because you're talking a much bigger, broader, diverse group of people who don't live next to each other, who don't know each other personally. And so those same rules that apply at a local level don't necessarily work at these bigger levels. And that might be what you're kind of running into, that when it's a smaller group of people who know each other, some of those rules work. But if you're trying to start with rules for a group that's 200 people, the 200-person group might actually not work if your group is only 10 people, because now you've actually put all this extra pressure and structure on top of a few people, kind of overloaded them. And kind of ironically, if there's so much structure but only a few people, I'm kind of making it up because I don't know your bylaws or whatever, Jordan, but let's just say if you imagine a group of like 200 people and you split up tasks, you delegate things like this essay is talking about. You delegate it to different committees or smaller groups that work on it, and then they bring it back to the whole group. If you make like 10 different committees, that makes sense. If you split up 200 people, that each committee is like 10 people, and that's a nice little working group that can work on it. But if you don't have 200 people to split it up, then what happens is a couple of people are now the committee co-chair for like 10 committees, and you're just overwhelmed with work, and you might burn out. And even if you don't burn out, the structurelessness that this essay is talking about is now you kind of have this informal thing where one person owns a bunch of committees because they are kind of running them by themselves because there's no one else to do that. And so now other people get kind of afraid to jump in and help with that thing because, oh, this person seems to be controlling all that stuff, and maybe I don't want to deal with that. So is that kind of the thing you're talking about, Jordan? Or,
yeah, it really is. The other issue is that this is a scientific club that I'm discussing, or at least the side that I'm working on is very like we're doing some pretty important stuff. that's like does require niche knowledge. So a lot of this stuff doesn't apply because it's it's not necessarily the group's not necessarily small and homogenous. It's not
Right.
you don't have the same not every task is something that everyone can do, nor is it necessarily something that everyone wants to do.
Right.
So like trying to figure out that middle ground where it's still like an open, community and people feel able to bring novel questions and stuff to the forefront is something that, we're really trying to strive for. But at the same time, there's definitely some issues when you have such a large group and it already does have like some necessary organizational structure.
Yeah, what that makes me think of here is this apprenticeship thing that I kind of zeroed in on when I was taking my notes. That sometimes there really are tasks that require some specialized knowledge, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in order to kind of keep up the structure and keep up the democratic goals of the organization, instead of leaving one person with that specialized knowledge by themselves kind of forever, then like I was saying, then they kind of become seen as the person in charge of that. And that starts to create the informal structure that we were talking about here, that person's in charge. Whatever the rules and bylaws say, we're not even really worried about that because really it's Bob in charge of it. That's what, start worrying about. So I think when you have these very niche skills, you need a specialist, but at the same time, think about ways that you can rotate people in an apprenticeship sort of capacity, to where they can kind of follow along or mirror that person and begin to learn those skills themselves. So it's not just one person. And, not saying that like one person is going to like try to purposely be malicious or mean or bad or anything like that, right? But just, even if they're a really great organizer, a really great person and all that stuff, it's still just good to not have it funnel through one person. That if that person's sick one day or something, right, it's good to have skills built up in everybody over time. Do you have any thoughts, AJ?
I have a couple of thoughts on this text.
Yeah, go for it.
So I got to admit, when I first read this text before, I had issues with it. Because I think with one thing we have to understand, and Garrett, and I think you mentioned this early on, is that when Friedman wrote this important article, really, it was out of concern that the women's movement in the 70s was being pushed out, right? And so not every woman was having a voice in an organization, let alone there were various radical feminist groups of the 70s that were forming also at that time. And she was kind of more upset that they're kind of like these little collectives and this little group and that little group, but they were not doing anything. So this was kind of like her call of concern of like, I mean, y'all need structure. I mean, what y'all doing is not good and we're going to be burned out really quickly. And then in this text that Garrett just laid out, there's some really good points. I mean, I do like her take. Oops, wrong one. I do like her take here about formal and informal structures. I like her commentary on that. Why having formal structures are important. And I agree that they are important. And then as well as the very bottom part of the principles of democratic structuring. So I think between those two things, at least for me, were my two takeaways on how to create a structure and then how make those structures democratic, because they do need to be flexible. Voices need to be heard. and good on Joe for doing that. But this is my problem with her text. You'll have a lot of anarchists get pissed off on this text. So there's a book out there called Stir It Up by Rinku Sen. Rinku Sen is an organizer. It's an organizing book. And Rinku Sen talks about freedmen in their texts, and Sen talks about freedmen for that very reason, that like there needs to be structure in organizations. But Sen also points out that while there needs to be formal structures, and we need to listen to freedmen, but we also have to pay attention to groups like the Zapatistas, like how do they work? American Friends of Service Committee, the Quaker group, they're also like a loose-knit collective kind of, but they work. Both those groups use consensus, you know, and Freeman kind of, without implying, well, I think she kind of implies it, but not in a direct way, of moving away from a consensus building type of decision making. Would you say that'd be correct, Garrett?
I'm actually not sure. I'd have to think about that.
I mean, because she doesn't like really directly say don't do it, but she doesn't say like, you know, work towards consensus, you know. And she's also not even saying, you know, use Robert's Rules of Order when decision making either. But I guess, I mean, I get this, like that's my commentary on this, is that while there needs to be structure and they need to be democratic, even the most anarchist collective that you're a part of, like there needs to be some structure to that, because we have to remember the circle with the circle A means order. So I don't care what anarchist group you're a part of. I don't care if you're a collectivist anarchist, a primitivist anarchist, deep ecology anarchist. I don't care who you are. There's always going to be order, you know. So if you need like a working group, then have a working group. If you need a committee, you need a committee, you know. So there's always going to be a level of hierarchy somewhere, you know. Just don't have, as Freeman points out, this like elitist formal structure where it's really top down, because that's where we get in trouble. Once we start building more hierarchies, taller and taller, the more isolated people are going to be in those hierarchies. So if we want to have a more of a democratic process, we need to listen to Friedman when Friedman points out, I'm scrolling. We're talking about that delegation, the distribution of authority, allocating tasks and everything. Like we need to listen to Freeman on that, because if we start doing that, then that formal structure of whatever organization you're going to be in is going to be fine. But you need to have that trust in your group. And you also need to make sure, as we talked about earlier about reading groups, we have to make sure that rules are in place. Because if we don't, then yeah, your group, that formal group or your collective or whatever it's going to be, is going to falter if you don't have those things in place. So that's my 2 cents on Friedman.
Yeah, that actually made me feel a lot more comfortable with the structure of the club that I'm somehow sitting at the top of a hierarchy for. Because like I don't see it as a hierarchy. really. I mean, I do, because one of the other leads literally drew a pyramid and like, but the movement, the freedom of information, especially what Freeman says, the diffusion of information from, top to bottom, for lack of a better metaphor, is like really open. At least it has been in the group so far. And one of my primary goals for this year, especially for new members, is to really make sure that information, like what we currently have, is like explicitly explained to everyone, so that everyone's on the same page. And all of our goals, which we've been pretty specific about making and listing out, are carried forward and made very explicit to people in such a way that where the doors of Congress remain closed and we don't really see the goals there. In the club that I'm helping lead, they are very clear, and also everyone should be on the same page.
Yeah, I should have asked earlier on if you were able to read this before coming on, Jordan, or it's totally new.
Yeah, it's new, but I'm also familiar with a lot of the concepts, because it has been 50 years since this was published, so people have really carried a lot of these ideas forward.
Oh yeah, there's been a lot of discussion since that time period in the New Left, of how to develop democratic organizations and decision-making structures and avoid lots of the problems. AJ had brought up a discussion, actually, that I think still continues to this day between consensus-oriented decisions versus making decisions with more of like a voting structure.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of anarchists that will swear by consensus building, because they want to make sure that everyone's voice is heard. And kind of the counterpoint to that is someone who wants to be really obnoxiously stubborn can block proposals just because they feel like it, and hold up the group from taking important decisions. And so there's always been this tension there about how do you get the most support on things while also not holding up the group from taking important actions that are maybe even time sensitive. I'm not sure. Go ahead. Sorry.
I see the phrase "tyranny of the majority" thrown around on a lot of the internet anarchist groups, and I don't really see that as too much of an issue, but a lot of them clearly do.
Yeah. I think that comes from kind of the other extreme, which happens a lot in the US, where if you just go with a simple majority, 51% can overrule 49%. Yeah. And there's something that seems very inherently wrong about that, that if there's that much disagreement, then maybe we should be going back to the drawing board, so to speak, and discussing this more and seeing if we can't find a different path forward if there's that large of a disagreement. But at the same time, like I said, if there's only one or two people blocking the 99%, that also doesn't feel very democratic, because if so many people feel the need to take an action, then you start to wonder, why are the one or two people blocking that? And maybe it's because they have a really important reason and we need to listen to them. That's absolutely true sometimes. But sometimes it's also because maybe they're motivated by, their class position in society or something, right? To take a different position than everyone else. So it's important to have that sort of analysis and understanding when we're designing these structures. And I don't know that there's necessarily one right answer. Every organization and every decision kind of has to think through these issues about what's the best way to get everyone involved in the process in a fair way. AJ, I think I saw you making faces, so yeah.
No, I don't.
Okay.